I really hope that the psychedelic industry does benefit from some of what we've been through and can look at, what you're facing and communicate with the legislators. No, that would be a bad idea. Let's look at how that rolled out over here.
Welcome to Psychedelic Source, where wisdom meets practice in the evolving landscape of psychedelic medicine. I'm your host, Dr. Sandra Dreisbach, and I'm here to help you navigate the complex intersection of ethics, business, and personal growth in the psychedelic space. Whether you're a practitioner, therapist, entrepreneur, or simply curious about this transformative field, you've found your source for authentic dialogue, practical resources, and community connection. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the stories, strategies, and ethical considerations that matter most to our growing ecosystem. Let's tap in to our inner source of wisdom and explore what it means to build a sustainable and ethical psychedelic future together.
The information shared on this podcast, our website, and other platforms may be triggering for some viewers and readers and is for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only. It is not a substitute for professional medical, legal, or therapeutic advice. While we explore topics related to altered states of consciousness, we do not endorse or encourage illegal activities or substance use. Always research your local laws and consult qualified professionals for guidance. The content provided is, as is, and we are not liable for any actions taken based on the information shared. Stay supported and informed, act responsibly, and enjoy the podcast.
On this episode of the Psychedelic Source, I talk with Marianne Bays, who is a cannabis industry business entrepreneur, consultant, analyst, and advocate, and a lifetime resident of New Jersey, a Jersey girl, as y'all hear her say in this episode. She's been studying and working in the cannabis industry nationally since 2008. And she's been a consultant on cannabis business license application projects in 8 states, including the District of Columbia, helping to win licenses for her clients in 6 of these locations, including one of the first medical cannabis business licenses in New York State. Dr. Bays performs ongoing cannabis industry analysis and understands state regulatory requirements, business issues, and opportunities across the United States. Founding operations member of Calyx Development, a real estate investment trust in the cannabis industry, and also a managing director of Mingle Ridge Business Resources, LLC, providing consulting services to the industry. But right now, she's currently planning to launch a New Jersey cannabis product manufacturing business, inspired a lot by inequity issues that she encountered in the space in her experience in the Northeast in the cannabis industry, that will hope to provide and produce a wide variety of branded products for the New Jersey market, working with brands from other states as well as brands with roots in New Jersey legacy cannabis market. Dr. Bays brings such a beautiful combination of business strategy and operations knowledge and experience in the cannabis industry and industry knowledge, and adds to her role of CEO of Northeast Corridor Provisions, a licensed contract manufacturers of cannabis projects and with regional aspirations. And I'm also proud to say that she's also a friend. And she gives us a little bit of insight about some of her journey, and both just as a business organization expert and how you can still have that sort of ethical mindset in the cannabis industry, and how important these business practices are to doing good ethical work. But also in terms of what we're focused on a lot of times in Psychedelic Source is relationships, being in community, being in relationship with one another, and how supportive that is. So I hope you enjoyed this episode and hear the adventures of Marianne Bays and where she's going next. Well, welcome, Marianne, to Psychedelic Source. I'm so grateful to have you here in relationship, to be able to talk about your work in the cannabis industry, as well as a bit about you and your relationship, not just with your work, but I think a lot of people wouldn't necessarily assume just by your appearance, that because you look like I mean this in the most lovely way possible.
Grandma next door.
Yeah, right. It's wait, I thought she was baking cookies, not cannabis cookies, right? And I'm not saying that's what you're doing, but maybe you could tell our audience a little bit more about you. How did you end up coming into the plant medicine community? Because, I understand you do have that organizational business expertise.
Yes, it really I've always had a relationship, not always. I mean, I was a young adult when I developed a relationship with cannabis, but cannabis has been in my life recreationally for many, many years. And so I was interested when I learned that medical cannabis was going to be legalized in New Jersey. That's what caught my attention. I was at a point in business where I wasn't really happy with what I was doing. I was getting bored. And so I looked around and New Jersey was getting ready to legalize. We finally did legalize in 2011. So 2009, we were in the let's get the law passed mode. And I began working with the activists on the medical side. There was an organization here in New Jersey that had been working for a decade or so before that. They are the Coalition for Medical Marijuana in New Jersey. And that was the group that I found, the people who were actively involved in making good law, pressing for regulations that would make sense. And they were medical professionals, they were patients, they were family members of patients. And at that point, I had recognized, although I was not a medical patient myself, I recognized the value of it for people that I knew and loved, friends and family. And so I thought it was an important thing to do. I thought it was an interesting thing to do. And I really got involved as an activist initially because that's all there was. And then, after the law was passed and regulations started coming out, then everybody turned attention to the practical. How's this gonna work? Is there a business possibility in it? All of those questions were being asked. And I was in a position where, I was known by the Coalition for Medical Marijuana. They were working with the senator who sponsored the law, Senator Scutari. And his office asked for an ideal rewrite of the regulations that were in draft at that point. And so the coalition, the executive director, Ken Wolski, called me and said, I don't know anything about business. He's a nurse. He's a nurse and he knows a lot about cannabis. But he didn't feel comfortable reviewing the business regulations. And so he asked me to take that on, and that was really what led me into the businesses that I've been involved with since then. And the business community was all around it. We had lawyers, we had doctors, we had people who wanted to be able to launch compassionate care. I think three of the companies that were given licenses had compassionate in their names, and the bill itself did too.
Yeah.
So that's what everything was about. But from my perspective, if we had regulations that didn't allow a business to succeed, we weren't going to have an industry.
Now, although maybe a couple quick questions here, 'cause for people, especially for our listeners who may not like, what would compassionate care usually indicate? Like, why is that word compassion so important in terms of the legislation and the advocacy?
Well, the history of cannabis law in the United States, evolved a compassionate care program for certain patients. I was fortunate enough to meet the widow of one of the original legal patients in the United States, and she talked a lot about what it took to get there. There were people who were finding that cannabis worked for them. Her husband had glaucoma, which was not responding to any of the available drugs. And he'd been told that he was gonna be blind by the time he was 30. I mean, it was
Wow.
progressing, and there was nothing that doctors could do for him. And then one day, now his wife says that, friends from college came to visit, and they brought some marijuana with them. And and after smoking it, he noticed that his vision improved. The halos that he was seeing went away, and so he began researching, has anybody looked at this, to see whether it would help with glaucoma? And he found that there were doctors working on it, and one of them was willing to testify and to work with him to make it so it was a compassionate use program that was developed by the United States, and it still exists to this day. To this day, there are a couple of patients left who still receive pre-rolls, not the best quality cannabis. I'm told there's seeds and sticks in it, and that the cannabinoid level is rather low. I doubt
Right.
whether they actually are great cultivators. It's been one place that's had the exclusive ability to grow for this program and for research in the United States, and so it's a problem. But anyway, that's where compassionate use comes from, and there's a it's the term that was used, if determining the medical necessity.
Right. Medical use, compassionate use, compassionate care, right? And I find it interesting, like, even though obviously recreational cannabis, recreational psychedelics, and plant medicines have been around for a long time, uh, and even therapeutic use has been around for a long time, that the legislation, at least in the United States, has been more open to pivoting, across the board, whether it's psychedelics or cannabis, in relationship to documented medical and therapeutic use. Even though,
Well, it's taken some pretty smart politicians and activists to get there,
no,
and and
absolutely.
and the use of these terms is a part of it. Who can say, "No, we're not gonna be compassionate"?
Well, I mean, the people say, like, "Well, it's just not the priority." But let's not go down the compassionate wormhole, because, like,
What?
obviously people care about compassion.
There are many cases where cannabis is the best treatment available.
See, no, and I love that. Like, that's the thing, like, sometimes people are open to considering, like, plant medicines, psychedelics as a possible treatment, but a lot of times they don't recognize that sometimes it really is, in fact, the best treatment, or the only, like, often there's this term called, best standard of care, right? And that our standard of care is based on the idea that this would actually be the best practice. And for a lot of these, sort of taboo or things that have been legislated out of our access, and now coming into access, uh, often are the best therapy, the best option. First, depending upon things like, we're not going to do carte blanche here and say everything, but there are certain things that, just to not just be open. Don't start with just like being open to therapeutic use, or just compassionate use, but be open to the fact that this could even be the best solution for certain ailments that people are encountering. And I think when
And
people really get that part,
a
yeah,
combination of traditional treatment and cannabis might be the best. It
right,
might be
right.
and that's the case with a lot of cancer treatment. The medical professionals will tell you, you should still have chemo, you should still have, but add cannabis because in addition to it dealing with side effects,
Right.
there's some evidence that it eats cancer cells.
There is, and I wanna go about this because, like, I remember, like, the Dosed, documentaries talk about some of this, at least in Dose 2, but I don't wanna detract us too much. I wanna make sure we're focusing because, like, you're based in New Jersey, and and could you tell us a little bit about you as a person? Like, are you from New Jersey originally?
I'm a lifer, yeah. I'm a third generation Jersey girl.
I'd be concerned? No, do we need an intervention?
But often when I say I'm a third generation Jersey girl, it has been kind of received and understood as a faint threat.
I think as a Californian, and a couple generations of that, identity, I think I understand that, and I've never even been to Jersey. Boom. And and even more so that you would be involved in this space. So, like, so as a Jersey girl, right? I mean, what were you taught about cannabis growing up? Right.
Well, honestly, um, uh, uh, I'm a child of the '60s, so cannabis was readily available, not very strong, not very good, um, uh, and it was clearly because of what we saw around us, not scary, not
Right.
harmful. I never got into any other kinds of drugs. I'm a weenie when it comes to that. I tried cocaine once, but I never wanted anything that would incapacitate me. I enjoyed the relaxation and the giggles, and even the munchies, um, with cannabis. Yeah, one of the first experiences that I had, there was a very large fruit salad served, and you could match, like this fruit with that fruit or that fruit and get different flavor combinations, and it was like an explosion in my mouth. No. So cannabis really was around me, and probably hashish, and exposure to that, was my only kind of foundation for c concentrates, which, it's stronger, you use a tiny little bit, and it was fun. Um, I've even made, um, water hash, so but I really wasn't tuned into the medical, and I tell people this, that, the first time somebody told me that they were using cannabis right before they went to sleep because it helped them sleep, I thought, "What a waste of cannabis. You're asleep."
I love this story. I love, even like, how like because a lot of the prohibition against the war on drugs in the United States, which included cannabis, happened during the 60s, right? And
But we also saw, things like the research that clearly said cannabis should be legalized. It is not a harmful substance and it can be medically useful. We saw those results and we knew that our government was simply ignoring them, not that the study was wrong. Okay.
yeah.
And now it's perfectly clear what they were doing because they've told us. They were basically trying to disenfranchise people who didn't like them.
And we don't have to talk about Nixon right now, but but I think it's worth saying, like, in terms of your own journey, right, having the recreational exposure, seeing, getting banned by the government, right, having a primarily recreational relationship with it, being a Jersey girl in a relationship,
And having a very good friend develop multiple sclerosis, that was also
oh,
pivotable a pivot point in my thinking about it because she was on opiates,
mm.
and the quality of her life was degrading, and when we were able to shift her to cannabis, she was delighted. In fact, she thrived during the early years of doing this, coming to meetings with me, speaking as an activist. It was actually, I think, a really valuable, um, activity for her. It gave purpose and meaning to what could often just be difficult, you know?
And so is this part of the story about how you ended up perceiving it more in a therapeutic lens? Like, what would you credit as your shift from seeing it as just recreational to it having more of a medical purpose and being more of an
Seeing
advocate?
people seeing people like my friend Sandy use it, need it in order to have a decent quality of life.
Mm.
'Cause and she was, very she could do sound bites, interviews that were just wonderful. And, at one point, she was describing the difference between, the opiates and cannabis, and she said, uh, you know, I guess I didn't feel as much pain, but it made me drool and forget who my mother was." that's not quality of life. Okay.
Right.
So she really needed, and she was nauseous all the time. Had very, great difficulty eating, sleeping. That was the main driver that got her to cannabis. She said she remembered in college that she hadn't liked cannabis because it made her sleepy. And when that came to her after being deprived of sleep for quite some time after she developed the multiple sclerosis, it was an amazing, change for her that she could actually occasionally sleep through the night, you know. And when you're young, as I was when I started using cannabis, you don't worry about things like that. I never had any trouble sleeping. Uh, it wasn't a concern. But as I got into this more and more, I found patients who had really been harmed by the medicines they'd been put on. Were experiencing organ failure because of their treatment for pain. And that's, uh, you're going to die, basically. They had to do something, and they still had excruciating pain. But the cannabis allowed them to get through it, you know, still go out and do things. It's kind of not, and I have seen evidence of what it can do in cancer, but it's very hard to talk to people about that because we don't have the research that we'd like to have on it. You
Right.
know,
And actually psychedelics has similar challenges, the amount of because, with the ban in the United States, right, and as it is for many countries, that included a ban on research, and I think a lot of people don't appreciate that we couldn't even
well,
look at
yeah,
the option,
the
right?
United States both built this schedule and said these substances should never be legalized, because they're harmful, and people will get addicted to them, which has really very little to do with cannabis and very little to do with psychedelics.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
Heroin, yeah.
and I
Okay.
and I'm curious, to hear a little bit more because, so here, in terms of your employment, you were doing work with business organization, right? And you said that you started getting into advocacy a little bit, but what was the final, switch that made you to pursue this as your full-time
Uh,
passion?
I have a passion for business. Okay. So as I began looking at what was happening from 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 a business weenie point of view, this is fascinating. Watching what's happening in this industry and looking at who's succeeding, who's failing, who started how, and how are they doing today. All of that's been really interesting. So in the Northeast, okay, quite different from California, we have a great shortage of a variety. Okay. And I
When
don't
you
mean
mean variety, do
strains.
you mean
I
strain
don't mean
variety?
strains. I mean products,
Products.
cannabis
Okay.
products.
And I
And
know before you say more about this, I wanna go back a little bit so that because it's important, I think, people to understand that, well, as things have gotten legalized piece by piece, state by state, region by region, the way that looks is qualitatively different, even if many of the same arguments are being made, like compassionate care, right, and medical access and therapeutic access. And I find it really interesting what happened in New Jersey in particular about how that could you speak a little bit about how did this go down in New Jersey specifically?
well, it's not just New Jersey, and my business vision right now is regional because it's not,
Okay.
because it really is in the whole Northeast, the
Okay.
way that we have legalized. We legalized for medical use first, and when we put a business structure to that, we, in our great wisdom, that's very sarcastic, required these businesses to be vertically integrated. That is, They had to be able to cultivate the product. They had to be able to manufacture the products, and they had to be able to retail them. They had to have all legs of that business, and it all had to be, confined within the state. You can't cross state lines. So the way that the initial medical businesses set up, they were vertically integrated. They were trying to do all of that. And not only that, we put pressure on them to get it open immediately because, after all, we're trying to get access for patients. So we pressed for that. It had been part of what we were saying all along. You're taking too long to get this done. We have people who are dying out here. So, using that argument, they were pushed into situations where they had to commit to, like, starting up in a time frame that was totally ridiculous. New York State is a great example of that. They wanted not only, you to be a cultivator and to be a manufacturer, but you had to have 3 retail operations, and they
3.
couldn't be located in the same area of the state, okay?
Oh, so they had to be
So
3 different regions of the
and they
state,
said, "Do
and
it in
and
6
all parts,
months."
and all parts of the process. So you had to grow, you had to make the product, and you had to distribute, uh, and you had to do it in 3 and you had to have 3 different areas where you did this and in the state.
But what they came down to on their do it within 6 months is you have to have a product and you have to have a retail operation open. Even getting to that was almost, well, it might have been possible, but only if you had a facility ready to go. I was working with some, cultivation experts out of, Colorado who, gave me a wonderful Gantt chart that showed me, step by step what was gonna happen and when you'd be able to plant and when you'd be able to harvest. And it was a year, okay? You were building the facility, you know, and you were starting the product, and so it was gonna be a year, and I said, "Okay, great job. Great job, guys. Now do it in 6 months." And they're like, "Are you crazy, lady?" And, actually, they were very polite. They were like, do you know anything about cult?" And I was like, "Yes, I know that this is totally unreasonable, but I also know by regulation we can't apply and get a license unless we tell them we're gonna do this in 6 months." So the young man like, "Great, okay, let's see, building permits? We don't need those. Just dive in, and start it from seed because they grow faster, stronger, and they skipped manufacturing. They went straight from flower to retail, okay? And, the state seemed happy with that. But then we also restricted them in forms. We said, unlike the real world of medicine where where we're informed by Mary Poppins that a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down, only the most basic forms, medicinal forms, were allowed. They weren't allowed to make, a beverage. They weren't allowed to make a good tasting gummy. In New Jersey, we had lozenges. That was the only edible. And basically, that was a bad tasting gummy.
And all that sounds like really, prohibitive. Like, I mean, I've seen this with other legislations around psychedelics, and as it's emerging, in different areas in the world and different areas in the United States, for instance, this desire, like often like this sort of like, okay, we want equity and access. So, like in your case, you're like, we're going to do it in 6 months, right? But not informed, right? There's often this pattern of. Um, legislators not having the appropriate education information to be able to implement correctly. It sounds like that may have been part of what's also happened, in cannabis.
Well, we also have this thing state to state where every state knows it's different. And we can't just learn from what the state next door did. We have to invent our own here. And, well, to some extent, that's not bad. New Jersey did some things at this point that I think are innovative. and did recognize some of the problems that we were building by doing this. But we made mistakes too.
Yeah, and I want to hear about the positive aspects, but I think it sounds like to me, at least knowing you in relationship, that a lot of it was actually inspired in your involvement and coming into business. Is the fact of the errors that they made around equity and access.
Equity, access, and business structure. I mean, I chose manufacturing because it got skipped over. When New Jersey put out its application requirements for the first medical licenses, the vertically integrated ones, they didn't ask one question about manufacturing.
Not one?
And if they had, I'm not sure we would have known how to answer them.
So wait, I'm like, I wanna really understand this. So what do you mean they didn't ask any questions about manufacturing?
People got a license that enabled them to manufacture even though they'd never been asked, "What are you gonna manufacture and what processes are you gonna use?" I mean, you had to give standard operating procedures for things, but they were focused on the cultivation and on the dispensing in terms of control. It's really all of the original regulations were really aimed at over controlling the substance.
So it sounds like both from a business perspective and from, an access perspective, this, t and even from your professional perspective, obviously, as someone who knows about organizations and business, right? Um, what was the results of this, you
The
know
result was very fragmented market. There wasn't like I started looking in Massachusetts, which also followed this path. I started looking there during the pandemic. New Jersey had not yet gotten to the point where it had fully legalized and was issuing licenses. So I already had the business plan and already thought it should be regional, and I went up and looked at there. Well, they had the same kind of limitations where people were not making a wide variety of products yet. And the biggest players in every state in the Northeast were what we call the multi-state operators. Okay. We say MSOs, as if being a multi-state operator is a negative. Okay. But in a sense, it always was because think about the consumer product industry. Well, think about Johnson and Johnson, say. Do they have to set up their operations in every state in order to make sterile bandages? In order they don't. They can ship cross state lines. We can't. Okay. And so that forced the companies that wanted to dominate this industry to set up duplicative operations in every state they went into. That's just a money suck. I mean, it's not the way you would do it if you had the option of crossing state lines and setting up what you wanted to set up, where you wanted to set it up, when you wanted to set it up. But we've controlled this to the point where you don't get all of those choices often. In most states, we have operated from perspective of we've set up the program to operate from a perspective of scarcity. You're only gonna get 5 licenses, and everybody's applying for 5 licenses. In some states, they've made it a lottery. Okay. In New Jersey and Massachusetts, they looked at it and said, every time we run a competition, we give an advantage to the multi-state operators. Because who else can say, I've got operations already out there in multiple states? I've done that before. Who else can say that?
Yeah, and this has been part of the criticism and maybe even someone, who I mean, I think there's just in general in psychedelics and plant medicines, because of what's happened in cannabis, in relation to corporations and how it's ended up pushing out a lot of small business owners, a lot of people who actually were the growers already, who had the expertise and the knowledge just simply by how things were legislated, and how it was doled out, right?
You also have to recognize that some of the people with the legacy experience were much more knowledgeable, but they had a hard time presenting their qualifications in a way that got fair treatment.
Now, and I love that point, right? Like that, that legacy, even if they were the higher quality growers with the more experience, with the certain expertise, they couldn't communicate possibly as effectively to the structures, governments, or, in a way that helped them to be understood,
Well,
right?
especially when we had, one of the final medical licensing actions that we did in New Jersey had a requirement that you show financial stability. And the way that they asked you to do that was presenting your last 2 years of tax records for the business.
Which
And so I said, and I mean, you can find this a published thing. It was on the CRC's website for a very long time, but they never responded to it with anything sensible. I said, if what you are trying to do is assure that on this criteria, the only people who get the high ratings are the multi-state operators who are already operating in another state, thereby pushing out all new entrepreneurs, then you've done a good job with this criteria. And they they chose not to change it. They offered us, uh, well, you can show it other ways. So, I mean, I was working with a bunch of people who had launched a cannabis real estate investment trust. We had great paper on that company, and it was, a lot of overlap between the two. And we presented that.
then
But
what happened?
they didn't even staff the selection process in a manner that was consistent. I mean, what I found in the end, and I had the process yielded ratings. You could look at the differences among the raters, and the differences among the raters at a glance told you they had no idea what they were doing.
Mm.
You'd get, on a scale of 1 to 5, you'd get a 5 from 2 and a 0 from 1. And you're like, that person didn't understand the question. Okay? But not only that, all that inconsistency was after they'd already announced who the winners were.
So this, of course, like, and we care very much about talking about ethical issues around here, and we try and touch on them both, making sure we're connecting to resources as a person and doing that in integrity. And I know, you and I know each other because of our work in ethics. But what this seems very clearly an ethical issue.
Well, government ethics is an interesting thing, and I all I can tell you is, repeatedly in state actions, there were shenanigans.
So Jersey girl. Yeah. When you say shenanigans, could you be a little bit more direct?
Yeah, um, uh, uh, in the New York action, we actually saw, remedial action taken. I was the project manager for a company that went in, big, Fiorella Pharmaceuticals. They had done, an enormous amount of work to assemble a team that was really knowledgeable. And they brought me in to manage it. It was a huge application process. I don't remember how many pages, but we are talking thousands of pages of application. Multiple volumes, had to be printed of this too, and I think one application was something like 7 binders. Okay, it was a massive undertaking to do this, right? And we did our number, and I'd worked with a number of different companies before, and I knew that this one was very strong. I mean, the quality of the people they had associated was quite high. The ideas they were putting forward were high. The CEO was a rather remarkable guy. But the first action happened, and we were told that we were less than half a point below the first 5 that were selected. All right.
That's interesting.
Now, we knew, that's what can happen when you make it a competitive action. All right. So now I have other friends who were part of the action who scored high, maybe not quite as high as us, but it's high enough to be concerned how the action went down. And they had people in the room where the results had been reported, and they knew that we were one of the first 5 in the ratings. But somebody walked into the room and said, now you have to change it around because these 2 have to be in the first 5. Now, they never wanted that story to come out, and even now I'm telling it so vaguely, it's not really coming out, right? But there was enough known about it so that pressure was put on New York State, and they finally came out and selected 5 more from the list, and those of us who'd been passed over by what they did in the first did get our licenses. Not in the first wave, but just a beat later. Okay. New Jersey was a different thing, and we'll never really know. But it did cause commissioner and a deputy commissioner to resign.
Interesting.
I was involved in the first New Jersey action, so we submitted an application. We weren't asked anything about manufacturing because I wrote that application, and it took quite some time. It was not until individual manufacturing licenses were being offered in the states instead of the vertically integrated ones that they actually focused in on what manufacturing was and how we could do it better and, things that they should have been looking at.
Now I want to bring it back to you.
Okay.
So, I mean, now that you weren't involved in this process, obviously you brought this into the administrative court and you learned
Yeah.
a lesson from
Yeah.
that and you're sharing that. And
I worked in a lot of other states too. So
Yeah,
I would get,
clearly.
a lot of my clients did well and got licenses, but where they didn't quite get what they expected, a lot of it was attributed to decisions made, at the state government level. It's very hard to have a straightforward, start to finish process where you get a license. But we have gotten better at it in New Jersey and in Massachusetts, where we're not pitting everyone against each other because it's a new industry. It will take care of settling itself. If there are too many dispensaries, they won't all succeed. If there are too many cultivators, the price of cannabis will drop. It's going to drop anyway because we have had hardly any in the program. So we expect that there will be a drop in the price of the flower, which will benefit a manufacturer. So I'm positioning as a manufacturer because that's a weakness in the whole area. In California, what I've seen are a lot of products that came out of the era where people were. It was a co-op model. People were supposed to join together, grow for each other, make products for each other, okay, and money would just be, cost of things, which evolved into a full-fledged, retail program and a lot of unlicensed manufacturers, but creative manufacturers who develop great products. And we never had that part in our part of the country. So it's a whole.
Because
And
of
it's,
that manufacturing gap, because of the
yeah,
manufacturing gap.
yeah.
And And I know, like, you're very much inspired by trying to address a lot of these inequities that you've noticed. And I don't think a lot of people would think like, oh, we need someone who has business organizational skills to help us with this. I don't think that's the go-to. And if anything, like people feel it seems like there's like an inclination, like, okay, no, that's part of corporate. That's part of what we're trying to change. That's very capitalistic.
It's very funny, and from the first time I got into that, people have been going, "Really? It's like business?"
Yeah.
It's like business, yeah.
No, so maybe you could speak a little bit to about that because there is a lot of these sort of like, especially in the psychedelic and plant medicine community and space, this bias against, business organization, business practices in the traditional way. And yet obviously you come with that expertise and being more informed, and it sounds like it may actually lead to better outcomes in terms of the ethics that people are aiming for. So tell me more about that.
Okay, so there are number of places where there's games that get played in the industry where a sheer business perspective tells you that's not the right way to go. Testing. You hear a lot about states that are having the testers are being motivated to show results that aren't exactly true because they want to keep the brands that are being tested as their customers. And so if they're doing what they call lab shopping and taking their product to 6 labs and saying, I'm going to go with the one that gives me the result that looks like I've got the best product, even if it's not, you've got a problem. Uh, there's a couple of things that motivate me. One is giving an opportunity to people who have been in the industry, but who may not have the wherewithal to be able to launch a business in the regulated industry. And it's not usually because of their records. It's usually because they don't have the money, they don't have any business training, they, they don't compete well. I've had clients coming out of, a community that don't know anything about a spreadsheet. I mean, if you are silly enough as I was to hand them one that's not protected, they will mess it up in like seconds. They're not gonna be able to get into the industry without having people that have more sophisticated business knowledge around them. And that then led to we're trying to offer.
Is it more sophisticated, or is it that, the sort of inequities around education,
Well, it's
that
inequities around education. It's they don't compete well because the language skills aren't as high. They have a lot of weaknesses that make them somewhat frightened of going it alone. I what I wanted to do, and so what I've done in the manufacturing business is provide a facility that could make someone's existing brand, okay, instead of having to set up manufacturing in every state in which you wanna manufacture, you can bring your product here, and I will charge you a fee to manufacture it for you. And that's just copying the consumer product industry. It's not rocket science. It's the way Pepsi works. It's the way General Mills works. I mean, they have co-packers, okay?
uh, and can you just describe co-packing? Can you describe co-packing? Because I mean, I expect, even though obviously we wanna appeal to people who are interested in supporting and making their business practices better, a lot of these terms are foreign to people who in the public.
In fact, I call us a contract manufacturer because that is we're going to manufacture an existing brand under contract with the brand. So the brand gets revenue from it, and we have different arrangements and different amounts of, uh, of work that we'll do. With some products, we will take them all the way to market. We will sell them, we will distribute them. For other products, we'll make them and then help the brand arrange for someone else to sell and distribute, whether it's the people in that brand, which could be badged so that they'd be, legitimate cannabis industry employees in New Jersey. They could then sell on behalf of that brand. But they'd be on my, employment roles. Or we're going to have wholesalers. Okay, so they might arrange to sell their product to a wholesaler, and the wholesaler will handle sales and distribution. There are different ways it can work. But what I'm trying to do is provide the support for someone who's making a good product to be able to continue to make that product, but have access to the market, to the legal market.
And that sounds really amazing. I mean, just simply, that this manufacturing gap, as it were, or filling a need because of certain expertise and understanding of, manufacturing organized, or just simply having distribution channel access, right?
Well, that's yeah. I mean, I'm finding myself thinking more about how to set up services that can support this variety of people. I mean, we have to have the manufacturing capability, the extraction capability, manufacturing and packaging. But beyond that, maybe we'll be good at selling. I mean, personally, my team will be good at selling one type of product. That doesn't mean we're good at selling all of it. So we have to have solutions for everybody that makes sense, and the ability to help them thoughtfully get through it. We also have to deal with. I've gotten a couple of products brought my way recently where there's a bit more development to do. We don't have most of the products that you've probably seen are sweet. Well, sugar's a good carrier of it. Fat's a good carrier of it. So chocolates, um, but it's not good for diabetics. It's
Right.
not good for everybody, and too much sugar is kind of a chronic problem with it. And I've had diabetics who respond very well to cannabis. But edibles don't really work for them because they're usually gummies or something, that's quite sweet.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so we need to have a variety of products. So pretzels were introduced to me. Somebody sent me a guy who they said, "I met this guy at a bar and his pretzels are great." So I sent him to you. He's from
I
another
I I
state.
I have to admit, I don't think I've heard of cannabis pretzels, but I know, but the concept of it.
Yeah. So, he is he's not really ready to bring them yet. He's ready to bring them personally, but I looked at it and said, "Okay, what's a serving?" These are pretzel sticks, the skinny kinds, right? What's a serving? We have a measure of an adult serving at 10 milligrams of THC. Okay, now the reason we have that is so that people can know what to expect when they're using a product. A 10 milligram product, they're going to respond to quite differently than a 20 milligram product. Some people need 20 milligrams. If you start with a 10, you need to double it. But we've got this standard so that people can figure out where they are in that. And it's a standard dosage that will work for most adults in
Yeah.
general.
Now I wanna go back to sort of like the average consumer, like the average person in New Jersey, right? Who wants to, support this kind of work, or even the average person interested in, like, psychedelics and plant medicines and doing advocacy or coming into this field. What sort of general advice would you give them? What sort of resources, what kind of support, what kind of wisdom?
Okay, so we formed the Cannabis Business Association so people could meet each other. But the need is so much greater now. I mean, it's not just, the beginnings of business thought. It is, who am I going to sell to? Who am I going to buy from? Who are the players in this? And so the Cannabis Business Association has put itself, forward as we will facilitate meet and greets. We do them monthly, and they're very casual, but you come out and, we learn who you are, you learn who everybody else is, and you leave with connections that are gonna benefit you. And we've got very active membership from lawyers and from accountants, as well as, people who are licensed to operate. In fact, at the beginning of the Cannabis Business Association, nobody was licensed. Nobody was in the industry in New Jersey. It was, medical only, and so we didn't even have we have never had a vote for who's on the board. We've never, set policies involving everyone because we just didn't have that many people licensed. So, if you want to get into business in New Jersey, the Cannabis Business Association is the best way to meet the most people. Um, uh, and it is also a source of training. Like we're doing, I worked with a vendor to get a free training session for people on good manufacturing practices. And that's getting a pretty good response. In some states, they actually required you in your application to tell them how you were going to comply with good manufacturing requirements. Good manufacturing requirements represent best practice and what FDA looks at to decide whether you could be a certified FDA facility. Now, we're cannabis, FDA is not going to look at us, but good manufacturing practices are still good manufacturing practices. And so I personally have been committed to maintaining all of the documentation that we need to in order to show an FDA-like federal agency that we have this capability. Because when we get to a point where we're deregulated federally or legalized federally and we can cross state lines, there will be oversight from FDA or someone like it. Some people say there will be a plant medicine department by then that'll include cannabis and psychedelics and who knows.
But I do love that you started with sharing about the Cannabis Association and that, meeting other people in the community and being connected in relationship, which is something we talk a lot about here in Psychedelic Source, about, building those relationships, building this as a community, finding the other peoples. I mean, even from throughout our conversation, gain this sense of how the organization, how things are structured, how those relationships are built and even built through the organizational structure are essential keys, right? And how good business practices, we're not talking about, abusive corporate bullying, or governmental abuse or anything like that. Just good sound practice often aligns with good ethics and good relationships. I think the vast majority of the public and even people who are in the either the cannabis industry or the psychedelic, community, that they don't often have an understanding of what it really takes, start to finish. Whether we're talking the government side, whether we're talking about someone who's coming from experience from industry, from underground practice, or anywhere in between, someone from a different business practice coming into this space. That there's this similarity across the board of these sort of challenges, these complexities that come up that are beyond just regular business challenges, beyond regular medical practice challenges or research challenges that are unique to this space. And I just like really appreciate the nuance you've brought to this conversation and your commitment to uplifting a lot of these issues and to try and provide greater equity and access.
Yeah, I mean, my goal is to both, I really wanna build a company that people like to work for. That's one thing. I mean,
Well,
that's a
you know what?
personal
Yeah, I love
drive.
that. I mean, you're a great person to talk with, but, to work for would be even, I mean, I imagine, like, well, what does that mean for you? Like, how do you know, great
I love
person.
coaching employees. I love watching employees thrive, and that's been, like, throughout my career, some of the most rewarding work that I've done. I was just talking to someone who does coaching, and I was thinking about the couple of times that I took coaching engagements. And it's so personally rewarding to see people grow and succeed. When you're consulting with organizations, as I was, sometimes you get to see that, but very often it's too far in the future. It's too subtle a thing. You don't really actively see it. So supervising people and teaching people gives me great pleasure. It's something that you can tangibly see. And I want to create good career opportunities for people. I sit with my team and think about different areas and say, well, I don't really want to bring in who I ultimately want in that job. I want to bring in somebody that just came out of college, knows a little bit, and can learn, because then they can become a manager in that area and then eventually grow into the top job by the time we've grown to need that job filled. So,
Now, I love this, and maybe this is a good part to kind of end on, is like if someone is looking for, like they're wanting to enter the industry, or they're wanting to learn more, and they need mentorship, and they need greater education, and they need support. What would you tell them to do if the only thing they have access to right now is this episode?
I would tell them to talk to someone like me. We have a lot of people who give time to this industry and help people. Um, and we can steer them, gauge, learn about their interest and where they are, and at least connect them with people who are doing the kind of work that they think they want to do, and help them, find their way into the industry. I'm looking for people, but so are others. And right now, I've had a couple of manufacturers come to me who aren't yet manufacturing their product. They've just got the idea. And because I haven't set up yet, I don't want to hold them up. They
Right.
need to develop that idea. So there's one other, they're actually viewing themselves more as an incubator. Okay. But they have the same ability that I do to bring a brand in and have it manufactured by licensed people and distributed to the legal market on behalf of someone who can't do it all themselves.
I love this, and I love that, finding someone else like you, being a part of maybe an association where they can find other people in community
Absolutely. That
relationships.
I tell people to do that all the time because it's the only way right now. We can't even advertise well. So, yeah, it's the best way is to go to events.
And
Yeah,
to be in a relationship and building those relationships. Well, thank you so
absolutely.
much. So thank you so much, Marianne. I really appreciate you taking this time to tell us about your work and about your inspiration. And I'm guessing you're not bored anymore. Are you not bored
No,
anymore?
no, I learn something new every day and come up with a new challenge every day. So, no, it's not boring. It's not at all.
Well, it wasn't boring talking with you today, and thank you
Well,
again for
good.
taking the time, and sending you so
My
much love and
pleasure.
well wishes in your new
I
manufacturing.
really hope that the psychedelic industry does benefit from some of what we've been through and can look at, what you're facing and say, and communicate with the legislators, no, that would be a bad idea. Let's look at how that rolled out over here, you know. Um,
Well, I at least I've learned a lot from you just from talking to you this time, and as someone who does a lot more in the psychedelic than cannabis, and I do feel like there's a lot of support for one another in the space, and there is this desire to learn from cannabis, and I think sometimes people in psychedelics don't remember that the cannabis industry is still very much developing and still very much, learning how to create and do business and to do it responsibly and to work in relationship. Every state, every country, however we're showing up. So thank you for showing up, Marianne, and
my pleasure.
yeah,
Always.
and you're definitely a good source for me. As I reflect on this episode, sometimes we got a little bit in the weeds, and not the cannabis weed, but also like the actual weeds of like some of the details, and maybe that can be challenging for some of us to like really get into the meat and potatoes of. But I think it also really shows how nuanced and complex a lot of these issues are, that there's this assumption of, simplicity even about what it really looks like to do work in this space and to do so responsibly and effectively. And even our biases against business practices and against certain industries and business entrepreneurship in general, in the psychedelic and plant medicine space, which actually works against us. But also you can see from my conversation with Marianne, like this real understanding and real relationship that she has with cannabis and her friends and people that really inspired her because of their own struggles. And you'll see a similar arc here of people in the West, of how we came from a lot of the recreational mindset to understanding some of the therapeutic benefits and then turning into advocacy. So I'm just really grateful for Marianne and for this episode, and how we're seeing also consistently about the need to be sourced in relationship, and how, there are other people who are willing to help you, Marianne being one of them, and that it really takes this sort of larger global mindset towards all of us, wherever you find yourself in the psychedelic and plant medicine community, whether you're a member of the public, whether you're a member of the government, whether you're a business person, whether you're an underground practitioner, wherever you find yourself, it's the relationships that make the difference for ethical practice. Thank you for joining me on Psychedelic Source. If you found value in today's episode, please subscribe wherever you get your podcast and share with others in our community. And if you're a psychedelic practitioner, therapist, or coach looking to identify blind spots in your practice or determine next steps for moving it forward, take the first step by visiting psychedelicsourcepodcast.com. Until next time, remember, start low, go slow, and stay connected to your source.